All right, hello everyone. I'm Dave Taylor from LincolnConspirators.com, and today I'm very happy to be joined by author Alan E. Hunter for a conversation about two of his newest books. By way of introduction, Al is a resident of Irvington, a neighborhood of Indianapolis. He is the author of several local history books about the area. He's also written about the multi-murderer Herman Mudgett, more famously or infamously known as H. Holmes, the Devil in the White City, as well as a book about the national, or maybe two books about the National Road, the first major improved highway constructed by the federal government starting in 1811. Al is a retired educator and a big history buff. He has been a regular front page columnist for a local Irvington newspaper for 20 years, maybe more, Al. I'm not sure.
Yeah,
Uh,
long time.
Long time. Al's columns are a mixture of history and pop culture and are really interesting reads. In 2020, Al published his first book on the subject of the Lincoln assassination. And it was this book titled The Peterson House, the Oldroyd Museum, and the House Where Lincoln Died. It's a wonderfully detailed history of the house across the street from Ford's Theater, where Abraham Lincoln breathed his last, and it is just filled with well over 100 photographs of the building, the residents, the collection, and it makes it just a really interesting read about this historic home. However, we're going to talk a little bit about this, but in at the end of 2024, Al has just recently published not one but two new books simultaneously,
Hmm.
both dealing with extraordinary people who made Abraham Lincoln a focus in their lives. One of the books is a biography about a current Lincoln scholar by the name of Dr. Wayne Temple, who goes by the name of Doc,
Yeah,
who as of this recording, Al, if I'm correct, is he's going to turn 101 in just a couple weeks
in February. Yeah,
in
yeah.
February. That's amazing.
I just
Um,
talked to him last night. He's spry as ever.
that's that's what you want. That's amazing.
Yeah.
So you have this book about Doc Temple, and then your other one, also very large, I'm showing the sides there, is about a different Lincoln admirer and collector of the past, Osborn Oldroyd, who operated two Lincoln museums, one out of the Lincoln home in Springfield, and then the other out of the Peterson House in Washington, D.C. And so it was these two books and Al's book from 2020 that made me want to interview him today. So, Al, thanks so much for agreeing to talk with me today. And is there anything big that I missed there in my little introduction?
No, I grew up in the Irvington area. I live in Hamilton County now,
Oh,
but
okay, got it.
it's one. It's a minor thing. I love Irvington, so I anytime I can get associated with Irvington, I'll take it.
Well, and I believe also, I guess one thing that I forgot to include is that you, I mean, I don't know if you're still doing them, but at least for many, many years, you were involved in ghost tours around
Yeah,
Irvington and whatnot, and showing them the local haunts, as it were,
yeah,
and stuff like that. And that they were very popular. I believe I saw you on the cover of, well, wasn't there some, well, at least in the newspaper and stuff like that. But
yeah,
I see this. There's a nice picture of you holding like a lantern, all dressed
yeah.
up and ready to give tours. Do you still do that?
I do, and I found that was the easiest way to get people interested in history.
Oh, absolutely.
History is a hard sell nowadays with a lot of competition. So if you can walk them around a place and tell them the history of the place and a couple ghost stories, then you've made history.
Oh
History
yeah.
fans.
It really is, I think, probably the most popular public history like thing that exists now. I mean, like
Yeah,
everyone, people who are really into like Civil War stuff will go to battlefields, but everyone will sign up to do a ghost tour of a place. Little do they know that they're getting a really good education in the local history with a few spooks thrown in. So that's, I
yeah.
think that's a great thing. Well, before we talk about your books, Al, I kind of had just wanted to know. It's clear that you've been bitten by the history bug. I mean, with your columns and your books and everything. And when you were an educator, did you teach history as well? I know you were
I
a high
taught
school teacher. There you
history and
go.
art, and I was a high school baseball coach as well.
You're a jack of all trades.
Yeah.
So do you recall when you were first bitten by the history bug and what kind of pulled you into history, as something that you wanted to have as a part of your life?
Well, history's always been a part of my life. When you're a Hoosier kid, I'm born and raised in Indianapolis. You grow up with two people, two subjects, Abraham Lincoln and John Dillinger. And
Yeah.
it seems like all over this state, at least when I was a kid, somebody had a connection, somebody had a Lincoln connection. Well, they're two more disparate people you'd never find.
Yeah.
Both interesting, and it's interesting because even today, you well know that Lincoln is still associated with the good and the bad. It's a fight good and evil. In Washington D.C., it's Lincoln and John Wilkes Booth, and in Illinois, it's Lincoln and Al Capone.
I was about to
They
say
go
when you
hand in
said how, Indiana, it's Lincoln, and I was born and raised in Illinois, same thing. Lincoln is always there. He's always present, so it makes
yeah,
sense.
and being a kid in Indiana and knowing that Lincoln was formed in Indiana, got most of his education in Indiana, lost his mother in Indiana. You realize that there's a connection. Now, the big thing was when I was a kid, his time in Indiana was pretty much, they didn't pay attention to that. It's Illinois,
We
and
we
oh, he's
claimed
born in
him. We
Kentucky.
took him.
Yeah, and rightly so, because
Yeah.
I think, in fact, from what I've learned of Lincoln, he really wanted to forget Indiana and put it in his rearview mirror, because Indiana was nothing but sorrow to him. So he would claim Indiana proudly, or he would proudly claim Illinois. So we had him, but you got him. So.
Yeah. Well, I guess that kind of goes. When did Abraham Lincoln and those around him, particularly with your new books, when did they start becoming a subject of interest to you? I mean, obviously, Lincoln's always on the periphery growing up, but when did you really become a Lincoln guy?
Well, I'm a product of IPS, Indianapolis Public Schools, and back then we used to spend a lot of time in the library. We didn't have study halls, and we didn't have free periods. If you got a break, you spent it in the library. And there was a book by Dorothy Kuhnhart Meserve, 20 Days,
Hmm.
that I checked out every time I could. I checked it out so much they had to fill different cards with my name on them. Regardless, I'd go in there and I would just study the pictures, because the Meserves are all about pictures. And I became a fan of pictures because of Lincoln and because of Meserve. So, and I was an offshoot of that was every time I would see a picture, I would focus on the things in the picture and wonder what happened to that. Lincoln's holding a book. What happened to that book? He's holding a document. What document is that? He's sitting in a chair. Whatever happened to that chair? Whatever happened to that table? Those were the things that led me into where I'm at today, which I'm a collector. I've always been a collector. And it's the being able to touch and dream of, well, maybe he held this in his hands, maybe he passed this. It's just that's the only connection some people have to him, and that's what drew me to Oldroyd.
And I was say, just seeing the background I talked about before we started, just I was admiring your own collection, and as you're telling me, you're completely surrounded. So you
I am.
definitely have a connection to Oldroyd in particular. I'm gonna go back, Al. I don't know if you remember the first time that you and I met, but it made my day. It was in 2016 or 2017. I was in Springfield, Illinois, and
Okay.
I was going to give a presentation at the Abraham Lincoln Library and Museum. And before my talk in the evening, I signed up for one of the walking tours that they do at the museum. And it was like the Lincolns around Springfield. It wasn't like at the Lincoln home. It was kind of the other haunts, like the hotel that they stayed at, or, the church that they attended and things like that. And I'm on this tour, just listening to the tour guide, and we're like walking across one of the streets of Springfield. And you, sir, like tapped me on the shoulder and asked me, "Are you Dave Taylor?" And I am floored because first of all, I am a nobody, and I'm just this Illinois kid who's just enjoying his time in Springfield, and to be recognized, I'm just like yes, and then you introduce yourself, and then we start talking, and you tell me about how you are researching and writing a book about Osborn Oldroyd, which I found fascinating because I'd never really met anyone before who had a really big interest in Oldroyd. And so I guess my question to you is why Oldroyd? Like, how did he, particular, other than was it through the idea of collecting Lincoln that you became familiar with him? How did he become this subject that you decided you wanted to write about?
Well, I'm a collector. I've been a collector all my life, and I'm surrounded by relics of all sorts, Lincoln related, Gettysburg related. So I see them every day, and I've chased them all my life. And Oldroyd, the more I learned about him, the more I became interested in him and what he did. And when you scratch the surface of Oldroyd, you realize this guy had a museum in the Lincoln home, and then he had another museum in the house where Lincoln died. And I began to talk to some of the officials, the scholars, the National Park Service people, and they all knew who Oldroyd was. And he always brought a smile to their face as soon as you mentioned his name. But not many of them had positive views of him, and what's more is not many of them really knew Oldroyd. They all had stories, and they were all more than happy to share those stories with you, regardless of whether they were right or wrong. And some of them were caustic. Some of them, I talked to, I won't mention their names, but I talked to one gentleman in Springfield that was at the highest level, and he blamed Oldroyd for placing a picture of John Wilkes Booth on the mantle in the Lincoln home, infuriating Robert Todd Lincoln. Well, that wasn't true. He didn't do that. He got blamed for that. It was the guy that took over after him, a man by the name of Herman Hofferkamp. He did that. So you're wrong about that. He wasn't wanting to listen. And then I spoke to one of the first people I tried to interview was a National Park Service person that had worked at house where Lincoln died for some 20 years. And I sent him an email, and he answered me via email with the most caustic email response you could possibly imagine, saying that Oldroyd conned everybody and lied about Henry Ford wanting to buy his collection to get the U.S. government to buy it. And that's from what I know, that's not right. So when I started the first couple of years, I realized that there's a lot of myth surrounding this man, and nobody has taken the time to research it, because you can research it.
Why do you think that Oldroyd, whether warranted or not, had such a poor reputation? Because people didn't look into it, they just took, these stories that had been passed down that weren't necessarily true.
Well, Oldroyd, you got to remember, Oldroyd's doing it on his own. The only
Hmm.
house museum at the time was Mount Vernon. There
Hmm.
wasn't anything else. And I pointed this out to Tim Good, and he was astonished because he had never thought of it in that terms, and he agreed with me. Um, Oldroyd is in the Lincoln House on his own. He's a renter. He's trying to pay Robert the allotted monthly rent, and he's trying to bring people into that house. Well, if you're living in a house in Springfield, they all looked like Lincoln's house.
Yeah.
It's the only difference was this one had Lincoln and yours didn't. So the furniture in there, the appliances, the rooms, they all looked alike. So how do you get people to come in and see a house that's just a mirror of the house down the street? Well, he put his collection in there, and that's how he drew people to Lincoln's house. And he had he was a bit of a rascal, as Robert Todd Lincoln said, but he was doing it all on his own. That was his mission, was to tell Lincoln's story through his objects. Most people at that time are trying to tell Lincoln's story by um, trying to decipher what his thoughts were. Impossible. Lincoln was a very complex man. So you cannot assume that this is what Lincoln was thinking. People didn't relate to that. The average Joe didn't relate to that. But what you could relate to is walking in and saying, well, there's the stove that he ate off of. There's the
Right.
chair that he sat in. Here's the sofa. Here's the bench. Here's the things that he touched. And that's, to me, that tells a story that everybody can relate to. So that's how I got interested in him, was just the things that he did to keep the Lincoln legend alive. This is before Carl Sandburg or anybody had attempted to. So
Yeah, and I think you make a good point that probably some of the derision that Oldroyd gets is especially because he was running a museum, but it's different from museums today, that he was trying to, survive. So it wasn't like it's the Smithsonian where it's free and come in and look at everything. That it's a business, but he is doing this public history, but in a way that had never been done before, and in a way that, of course, we wouldn't do today. Like we still have, house museums, and we still demonstrate, show off artifacts. But of course, he was doing it, before all of the rules of how that should be done. And so from a modern viewpoint, he looks like he could appear like a grifter. It looks like, why is he charging money to come in and look at these things? Or the stories that come across about relics, especially how people love to collect relics, but that wasn't an unusual thing to want a relic of a place you have visited, but it looks bad in a modern sense. And so he gets a bad rap because he was before these modern practices were even thought of, because he had to lay the groundwork first.
Well, and there's a certain amount of contentiousness between scholars with Robert and Robert Todd Lincoln's relationship with Oldroyd, and what you learn in the Lincoln field. Because let me be clear, I'm a newspaper man. I'm not a scholar. I write in a newspaper fashion, and if there's anything that a newspaper man like me will do is try to hit the highlights and try to decipher and get through the esoterica, so to
Yes.
speak, and cut straight to the issue. And Robert had some problems. Robert was an interesting individual. You'll never get a Lincoln scholar to admit that, and I'm
Right.
sure that people are rolling their eyes as they're hearing me say that. But you know, Robert claimed that Oldroyd was a deadbeat who was constantly behind on his rent. Well, Oldroyd wasn't the first. The other two renters before Oldroyd didn't pay their bills, and
Yeah.
why? Because the house was falling apart. And
Ah.
Robert decided, I'm not spending any more money fixing up that house that I don't want. I just want
Ah.
to, he wants the monthly rent. He does not want to spend money fixing up that house. And he never intended on living there. And he only visited it once after he left in 1865. So the relationship, Robert was not a slumlord,
I was about
but
to say, is that
Robert
the,
was
is that the headline here? Robert Todd
no,
Lincoln,
no,
slumlord?
no.
Okay.
But what he was, and he's an absentee landlord.
Mm.
There's no question about it. And so things were falling apart, and he just didn't want to deal with it. Robert's operating at the highest level of government at that time, at the same
Absolutely.
time that he's working with Oldroyd. So he really doesn't have time for this. He put a guy by the name of Conkling in charge of it because he didn't want to deal with it anymore. Well, that's fine. But Conkling wasn't a whole heck of a lot better than Robert about it. And why is that? As James Cornelius famously pointed out to me one time, he said, well, Robert and Conkling, they're Harvard and Yale men. They look down at everybody naturally, and especially a guy like Oldroyd. How you can do that for a three times wounded Civil War veteran is beyond me, but that's what they did.
Well, give me a little, let's go. I guess we've been talking about him without really defining him for our audience. Can you give me just a quick summary of who was Osborne Oldroyd?
Oldroyd is born in Ohio in 1842. His parents named him Osborne Hamilton Ingham Oldroyd so that his letters would spell out the name Ohio.
Love that.
He never signed his name like that. He never referred to
He
himself
was
like that.
embarrassed by it.
Yeah, well, yeah, and he never mentioned his parents in any of his writings. And Oldroyd was
Interesting.
a prolific writer, so there were some issues there. I think there's love there, but I
Hmm.
just think that there were some issues from early on. He's an asthmatic kid, severe asthmatic, so he learned to. He spent most of his time confined to bed as a youngster, so he naturally began to collect things, rocks, flowers, any clothing buttons, anything he could get his hands on. And then he realized that if I ever want to get out of this bed, I got to get strong. So he began to go outside and hike the mountains and the hills. And he began, like any collector, started collecting more. Well, he's an ambitious kid. He opens a little newsstand next to his dad's jewelry store in Mount Vernon, Ohio, and he sells newspapers. And one day, one of the newspapers comes in with a biography, of the Wigwam biography of Abraham Lincoln, with the name spelled wrong on the front. That's how early it was. And he took this thing and he kept it, and he read it cover to cover over and over and over, and he was sprung. He began collecting Lincoln from that moment on. So he's one of the earliest Lincoln collectors because Lincoln hadn't been elected president then, and Lincoln really wasn't anything but an average citizen
Yeah, it's
at that
interesting
time.
that he took to Lincoln before, yeah, and he was really in the national prominence.
All because of that book.
Hmm.
And luckily for display, but it's in the National Park Service Research Center in Landover, and I got that was a thrill to be able to hold it in my hands, gloved
That's cool.
hands, but hands
Of course.
nonetheless. Um, so he started collecting Lincoln at a young age. His father ran a photography shop in Mount Vernon, and it coincides with the start of the Civil War. So local soldiers are enlisting, coming in, getting their pictures made by his dad. And Oldroyd gets the bug, decides he's going to enlist. He enlists. He serves with the 20th OVI, and he goes to Vicksburg. He's wounded 3 times there. He's promoted to the rank of sergeant. And when he left, he resumed his Lincoln collection in earnest. He started writing letters to people. And one of the first letters he ever wrote was to Robert Lincoln.
Hmm.
It's in the collection of Chicago University, University of Chicago. It's in the book, and it's fascinating to think that they were connected that early. This, I think, it's 1869, if I'm not mistaken. So that's how he started, and he just grew from there. He kept buying anything he could get his hands on. Lincoln Associates.
And then, so how did he end up? Because his first museum, that he opens is he's living in Springfield. How does he go from just being a collector to suddenly, being a renter of this, hallowed home in his point of view?
Well, Oldroyd, once he left the service, he was a government employee. He was a officer at the Old Soldiers Home in Dayton, and then the Home for the Insane, which is an unfortunate name to be
Yeah.
used, offensive name nowadays, but quite common back then. He worked there. From that point on, he started to branch out and wanted to be more of an entrepreneur. And from that point on, you see him just moving closer and closer and closer to the Lincoln home. He goes from Mount Vernon to Dayton to Columbus to Springfield. And his wife Lida's parents were from Springfield,
Ah,
and that when the two got married, even though they lived in Ohio, they traveled to Springfield specifically to be married in Lincoln's home, and
ah.
then moved to Springfield shortly afterwards. And again, he's living in Springfield. He's trying his hand at all sorts of woodworking businesses, candy shops, ice cream shops, magazine shops. None of them really work well for him. But the whole time, anytime a house would come available that is closer to the Lincoln house, he'd pick up stakes and he'd move there. And he'd live
Ah.
there for 2 or 3 months, and then another house would come available and he'd move his family there. And all the time, he's just moving closer and closer to the Lincoln house. Finally, he rents the house right across the street from the Lincoln house. And a man by the name of Wentlet, I believe his name was living there at the time, and he was leaving. And Oldroyd heard that Wentland was leaving and moved into the Lincoln House, because Lincoln House was in pretty bad shape back then. It was described as a flop house by John Carroll Power. Robert didn't like that. So,
Well, and
uh,
as you said, it was like now when you go to Springfield, it is they try to preserve that block, and but still the Lincoln home is the gem right there, even with
yeah,
still some of the other houses. But like you said, back then it was just another house. There was
yeah,
other than Lincoln lived here and everything like that. It was just a house that was for rent, like anything else. It wasn't
exactly.
this hallowed place. And then so he's at the Lincoln home, and how long is he there? That does he live there before he is essentially evicted by Robert Lincoln?
Well, he's he's there in 1883. We know that, and in 1893, one of the things that Oldroyd did that he does not get credit for, because there's a lot of things that he did that he does not get credit for. It is my belief that without Oldroyd, the Lincoln House could have been gone,
Hmm.
and the Peterson House certainly could have been gone without the efforts of Osborne Oldroyd. You're not going to get these Oldroyd haters to admit that, but it's true.
Hmm.
You can see yourself, and Oldroyd was the one that got Robert to donate the house to the state. It was through Oldroyd's efforts, and the records, the documents to prove it, are in the Illinois State Archives building for anybody to see. But nobody cares to go. Even Tim Good said, "Wow, I didn't really realize that," because the original bill appears to be written in Oldroyd's hand and then copied in the state senator, representative, whomever, Bogardus, I think was his name, copied, but word for word from Oldroyd's original proposition. But in 1893, and Oldroyd at this time thinks he's going to be curator forever, custodian forever.
I mean, he helped
Uh,
preserve the building. You would think it
he
would be
did.
his due.
He did, and he had friends in all the right places. The problem was they were all Republican friends.
Mm.
Illinois was a strong Republican state at that time. In 1893, a man by the name of Altgeld was elected governor. He's a Democrat, and not only is he a Democrat, he's a slightly radical Democrat. He's looked upon favorably today, but back then he was seen as a radical. And the first thing that Altgeld did when he came into office was to get Oldroyd out of that house. And Oldroyd was thunderstruck. He was absolutely thunderstruck. He didn't expect this to happen. Even Robert Todd Lincoln didn't expect this to happen, and
Ah,
he'd been divested of the house years before, and Robert wasn't happy about it, which you know that shows you that he and Oldroyd didn't have an acrimonious relationship if Robert
right.
wasn't happy about it. But Altgeld threw him out.
Mm.
And just as it happens, there's about a 3 or 4 month period there where Oldroyd does not know what he's going to do. He's thinking that he may have to sell his collection. And just as fate would have it, a group in Washington, D.C. had purchased the Peterson House as a centerpiece for an upcoming Civil War GAR convention, basically in Washington, D.C., but they didn't know what they were going to do with it. Well, Oldroyd says, I have an idea.
Yeah.
And he contacted some people and volunteered to come out there and display his stuff. And that's what he did. And he ended up moving there, put his stuff on display. And it was a well attended opening. All kinds of muckety mucks were there. The Supreme Court, Justice Supreme Court were there, senators, famous people, luminaries. And they opened it up, and within a couple, 3 years, the Memorial Association is gone. Oldroyd is left by himself, and he again is trying to make ends meet any way he can, and it's hard for him to survive off the quarter pop admission fee
Mhm.
because everything in Washington D.C. is free. You
Yeah.
can go to any of the monuments for free, even today.
Yeah.
Smithsonian's free; they're all free. So why would you go pay a quarter, which was a substantial amount of money in 1893, to see this building? But that he he hung on by the skin of his teeth, and it is my belief that had he bailed and sold his collection and bailed, you could very well have lost the Peterson House because, as you know, you've been there. It's
Mhm.
surrounded by sky rises.
Oh, yeah.
It's the only thing there, and you know that there were people that were itching to tear that building down and put something up in its place because it's falling apart. It was falling apart in 1893, so it worked out perfectly, and I give Oldroyd an awful lot of credit for it. So
Absolutely. And then as the main story goes, then he does convince the federal government to buy his collection, which becomes the centerpiece for kind of the Ford's Theater Museum. I mean, they already had some things from the War Department, but when they opened, they didn't have enough artifacts and stuff like that. And you're talking about it, yes, there's lots of papers and so many things have been written, but when people go to a museum, they want to see the things. And Oldroyd really is responsible, aside from like the few things that were trial exhibits. Most of the bulk of the Ford's Theater collection in those early days was the stuff they bought off of Oldroyd. And so he is really responsible for helping that museum get on its feet. Without
yeah,
him, then even the museum itself may not have been successful.
yeah, and it's a strange thing because even today there's a battle going on. I've served on several historic boards and museum boards in my life, and there's always the battle: do we do static displays or do we do objects? Do we display objects? Well, if you display objects, it's always more popular than a static display, and people can relate to objects. And if you go in there and you see things that Lincoln purportedly handled, things that Lincoln owned, things that he lived with on a day-to-day basis. That brings it closer to you. When he's in Springfield, when Oldroyd is in Springfield, he's concentrating on things from Lincoln's days in Illinois, earliest days, New Salem, and his birth in Kentucky, with a little bit of Indiana, but not much of Indiana. And that's one of the things that brought he and Robert to loggerheads is because Robert didn't want to focus people focusing on what he considered to be his father's low period.
Yeah.
Before he wanted people to think of Lincoln as the marble man. So that was one of the things he didn't like. And that's why he called them traps. Robert called them traps. But when he goes to Washington, D.C., and you can see this, you wrote an excellent article on the signage of the house where Lincoln died.
Mhm.
Perfect article. And in your article, you can see just by looking at the signage, the first couple, 3, 4, 5 years that he's in the house where Lincoln died, he's talking about Springfield items, Illinois items. Soon he graduates and puts together up a new sign with more objects, and Springfield is out. Springfield's off that sign because Oldroyd quickly, after he went to Washington, D.C., he became the go to guy for the assassination,
Yeah.
which he was not in Illinois. And anybody that wanted information, anybody that wanted pictures of the conspirators, pictures of the places where these things happened, they went to Oldroyd because it America was still smarting with the death of Abraham Lincoln, and they didn't like to think about this stuff. And that's how he got all this great stuff, is because nobody wanted it. They didn't want it in their house. They didn't want it to be associated with it. And Lincoln or Oldroyd got it, and he quickly became the savior of those of us that are just as interested in this cowardly assassination as we are in the Lincoln legacy.
Yeah, and I think that's a very important point to bring up is that Oldroyd really was kind of the first assassination historian, even though it
Yeah,
wasn't something he aimed to be, but being a collector, and especially when he moved into the Peterson house, being that's who else are you going to ask?
yeah.
Who's the person who knows about this? The man who lives in the house where Lincoln died, and then of course, yeah, Oldroyd is a name that I think the assassination historians know more than the regular Lincoln historians. They know about his time in Springfield, but to us, he actually is a key person. His 1901 book, The Assassination of Abraham Lincoln, is fabulous. It's like one of those early like histories of it because of his collecting ability. And the second thing is that the man walked the Booth's escape route. And I want to ask you, which is just amazing. And he did it at a time where some of the people are still alive who interacted with Booth or knew from neighbors who had. And he has these great first person interactions with these very tiny people in Southern Maryland and Virginia, which are fascinating to us. But I love the fact that he walked it, and this was not the only thing that he did. My understanding is that Oldroyd was just a huge pedestrian. Can you tell me more about, in addition to his Lincoln stuff, the man just loved to walk?
He did. He was pedestrianism was a real thing back then. I mean, you got to remember, there's no pro football, no pro baseball, no pro basketball, uh, and Americans love their sport. Well, the sport of choice was pedestrianism, and these you'd basically go to Madison Square Garden and you sit there for hours upon hours to watch these 5, 6, 7 day events, and it's just guys walking around the track.
Really?
It was the thing to do, and it existed back in Lincoln's time. I mean, there's a story of the world champion race walker, a man by the name of Payson. He w planned on walking to Lincoln's inauguration from Boston, and he did it, and he made it. And Lincoln famously said, "Do you want me to pay? I'll pay your fare home." And he said, "No, I'll walk it home." But whether this influenced Oldroyd or not, I don't know. But I know he picked up the habit while in Illinois. He routinely walked Springfield to New Salem, what became known as the Post Road, Lincoln Post Road. And again, he along the way he wouldn't tell anybody why he was walking. But he would talk to anybody that he saw, would knock on doors, see people out in the field, ask them if they knew anything about Lincoln. Well, of course, they all had Lincoln stories. And he, again, got the stories, but more importantly, he got the objects. And they would say,
Mhm.
oh, well, yeah, Lincoln was our surveyor. And when he was here, he left this shirt, or he left this hat, or he left this tool, and we never saw him again. So we could, Oldroyd, well, I'll take it off of you. And he'd take it back. And he went in search basically of trying to find the remnants of the Lincoln properties that he stayed in New Salem. He wasn't very successful. He found a few logs and a few relics, and he was trying to nail down the Anne Rutledge
Mm.
connection,
Mhm.
which he was never. He was constantly in search of a picture of her. Never found one, and I don't believe a picture of her exists.
Yeah, not that I know of.
But that was the habit that he picked up, and when he went to Washington, he just continued it. He that was what he did for fun, and he would tell Lida that I'm going to Baltimore, and she would have to ask him, "Are you walking?" Because he was just as light, because she knew if he's walking, I'm not going to see you for 3 or 4 days. If you're on the trolley, I'll see you this evening. He would walk, and he was famous for taking these walks, and they could be 300 miles, they could be 800 miles, and he did it pretty much all on foot. Walked every Civil War battlefield that he could get around. Of course, in Washington D.C., there's dozens of them within easy walking distance. Well, he walked to Gettysburg,
Wow.
and there was an ulterior motive with Gettysburg because that's where the Oldroyd family first landed in
Mm.
America, was Gettysburg. So he went back searching for remnants of his family legacy. I don't know that he ever found them, but he would stop every place along the way. His famous walk was the 90-mile walk to retracing Booth's escape route. But the one that was most personally important to him was he couldn't walk to Europe, but he took a boat, went to Europe, walked 1,400 miles through England, Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. It took him a couple months, but that was his lifelong ambition, because he had grown up hearing stories from his grandfather from the old country about how they were great walkers and this such beautiful country. So that's why he did it. And one of the things that I was so happy to see, and I feel like I'm the only person that's ever looked at it and read it cover to cover, is at the University of Chicago, they have his diaries from his
Wow.
walk abroad, his walkabout. And I read every page of it, just because that was important to me, to see what he took a bunch of slides of it, and he went around Washington raising money for the veterans, because he's a adjutant general of the GAR in Washington D.C. And he would take these slides and raise money for veterans causes.
Mm.
But those slides have disappeared, so I don't know what happened to them, but they're gone.
Well, yeah, and I was about to say, even the booth for his booth walk, like we are really grateful to him because some of the pretty much the earliest photographs we have of Booth's escape route, like pictures of the Dr. Mudd house or the Surratt house, are from the walk he did in 1900, 1901, and he brought his little brownie camera with him.
Yeah.
And so I like you, visual things are very important to me, both
Yeah,
the
well, you and I have shared
artifacts.
those pictures before. I
Yes,
remember we
exactly. And
shared
I
those.
would, when you were doing your research, I'm like, oh, have you found some of those originals? Because aside from one article that predates his walk, there was a guy in 1895 who also did. He visited some of the things, and there are some photographs that were then turned into etchings. Other than
Yeah,
that, Oldroyd's pictures are the oldest we have, and even those are 40 years, almost 40 years after the fact, but still they're the closest we have to what did these places look like back then. So that's why
absolutely.
I've always appreciated Oldroyd for doing that, and his walking is just amazing to me. I remember seeing an article about him when he walked, I forget, I guess it was to New York to stand in front of a Lincoln statue, and there's this nice picture of him with his cane or whatever, and he's just
Yeah,
standing in front of this statue, and that he has just walked there from DC or something.
yeah,
And yeah, it's just amazing to me. And
yeah.
other than his diaries, are there one like physical artifact or a group of artifacts that you saw during your research that were really that you felt were maybe was the diaries that were the most important or the most fulfilling for you to see in person, whether with gloves or just be around, whether it's a part of his collection or something related to his life?
Well, the National Park Service has several pieces from Oldroyd's collection. Unfortunately, it's not what it should be.
Mm,
I've talked to many sources in 15 years that confidentially told me they're reasonably certain that it was decimated by people taking things out of them over the years.
uh,
It was poorly stored. It was poorly cared for. It was never really under lock and key, except for the most valuable things in the collection. So sadly, when you see that, there's stuff that should be in here, because one of the things I did in the book was I tried to fashion a virtual tour as closely as I could for both the museum in Springfield and the museum in Washington, D.C., cobbled together from newspaper accounts and Oldroyd's own accounts, so that you could read it and try to get an idea of what it was like to actually walk through the museum. And when you do, there are many, many, many artifacts and objects that are spoken of that are gone. We don't know
Mhm.
where they're at. Some of them we don't even know. They're so tantalizing because you just like to know the backstory. Well, that's one of the sad things about the Oldroyd uh, um, collection is, he's doing it on his own. There is no standardized way to mark items, to identify items, to establish provenance the way that you would do today. Um, so in in the interim from 1926 to 1930, some of these things, the placards were separated from the item and maybe thrown away or maybe lost or maybe destroyed. So you have the item, but you don't have any idea what it is. It's a
Yeah.
Bible from 1865, but what's the significance? We don't know. And that's the sad thing about it. And in my research, in the when the government tried to reorganize it. U.S. Grant, the third, was in charge of it, who's a legend in the National Park Service, gruff old guy. But in the early 60s, he tried to reorganize it. And he spoke about how Lida, after Osborn had died in 1930, Lida and her brother, Benjamin Franklin Stoneburner, came in and he said, clean out the junk, clean out the
Mm.
junk, save what you think we need to save, and throw away the rest. Well, that's they hauled out several tons of rubbish
Wow.
by Grant's own account. Well, you and I would think, well, what was in there?
Yeah, I'm sure not all of it
I'm
was
dying.
rubbish.
Yeah, I'm dying to find out what was in there. We'll never
Hmm.
know. So the things that I saw at the National Park Service were great, but they're kind of sad because there were a couple of them that I knew exactly what they were through the research, but they were unattributed. So they
Uh,
sat in a file. I know what it is. Do you know what it is? Well, the guy that was with me that day was in charge of the Frederick Douglass Museum.
mm,
Uh, and he's not really a big Lincoln fan. He's concentrating on Douglass, so
yeah.
he didn't really care. So there, there's still fantastic things in there. My, I was happy that I got to hold that wigwam edition in my
Yeah.
hands because that meant a lot to me. My favorite story is one that's not Oldroyd related at all.
Yeah.
Went to the Smithsonian to see a few things that they had that were attributed to Oldroyd. And the young lady there, who I won't tell her name because I don't want to get her in trouble,
Right.
she invited me to go down to the vault. I thought, wow, this is great. Who's going to turn that down?
Yeah.
So we went down there, and she had me put on a pair of gloves, and she let me hold Lincoln's gold pocket watch,
Oh,
and
wow.
that was a thrill.
Was that
That
the
was a
one that has like the secret message inside of it?
Yes, it's the
Oh,
one
that's
that they
so cool.
used in the Spielberg movie that they taped. She knew all about it. She let me hold it. And I just thought, oh, this is a once in a lifetime thing. But she came up with the best line in 15 years of research that I encountered the entire time. When on the day of her meeting, I emailed her or texted her and said, "Are we still on?" She said, "Yes. Come on into the main building and meet me at the Batmobile."
You gotta love that.
That's the greatest line I heard the entire time I was researching.
That is funny. So how long had you worked on this Oldroyd book? I mean, I met you 2016, 2017, and you were working on it, but how long did it predate before it finally came to fruition in 2024?
Well, it kind of germinated around 2008, 2009. Started working in earnest around 2010. I met my mentor, Doc Temple, around that time, and James Cornelius, who was the curator, longtime curator of the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library Museum. And those Doc was the authority on Oldroyd at the time. He had written a book, a history of the Lincoln House, and he
Mm-hmm.
had delineated the Oldroyd biography better than anyone had up until that point, including Oldroyd himself, who wrote a kind of a biography of himself under a fictitious name, is my belief.
Ah,
But guy by the name of Benham put his name on it, but I think it sounds like Oldroyd to me.
uh,
But that's how I started. And as I started talking to people, as I told you before, there was so much disinformation going through, and I thought, you're not even
I
giving this
I
guy.
believe some of it too. I remember telling you some of those stories when we met that first day, where I was like, "Oh, that was the schmuck who put a picture of Booth on the
Yeah.
counter." So I was part of that disinformation because I didn't know any better. I just heard it from others. So yeah,
Well, and you go down so many of these tributaries, to the point where you're just like, how did that happen? Well, that story in particular, since you're a Booth guy and
yeah.
you know more about Booth than anybody I know, um, it was put up there by a man named Herman Hofferkamp, who was a straight up government appointee, a Democrat, took over for Oldroyd. And when Oldroyd left, he denuded the house of his collection. The only thing he
Hmm.
left was the sign in book, the register. That was all that he left. Took everything, and all of a sudden the newspapers are like, nobody's going to visit this house. It's empty. There's
That,
nothing here anymore. And you've got people coming in from all over the country expecting to see Lincoln objects. So what did the state and all their wisdom do? They went to Hofferkamp and they said, get some Lincoln stuff in there. Do it like Oldroyd would. So he started going around the neighborhood and picking up this with questionable provenance and saying, well, I think Lincoln touched this one time,
I'm
or he walked by
surprised
it.
there was still stuff left in Springfield after Oldroyd had been there
Well,
for so many years.
your surprise may be well founded because
Yeah.
we don't know.
Mm.
But he quickly put things in the house and attributed them to Lincoln. And the state was very proud of this. And people would come through during those 4 years. Well, as soon as all next election cycle comes, Alcdead's gone,
Mm.
and a Republican comes in and replaces him. Well, Hofferkamp's gone. And this stuff that was so important to the state, about 3 weeks, a month after Hofferkamp was kicked out of the Lincoln, he had a estate sale with all of the stuff that he had on display in the museum. That's how important it was to the state of Illinois.
I see. Uh,
And he was the one
he
that
put
put the
Booth.
picture of Booth on the mantelpiece.
Interesting. So this book, your Oldroyd book, is is a beast. I mean, it is.
It'll make a good doorstop.
It may. I mean, and it is. And it's just filled with picture. Well, I love, as we've talked about, as visual. And I already knew that you were big on visuals from your much smaller book on the Peterson House. But I just love how you have filled this to the brim with, pictures of Oldroyd, his collection, and just everything. And I admit I haven't finished reading it because I mean you sent it to me and I appreciate it, but I haven't read it yet because it is going to take me a while. This obviously is quite different from the book from 4 years ago. How did this book, which is very similar to like the Images of America type of books that
Yeah.
exist for towns and like you have done for your National Road books, how did this come to be while you're in the middle of this?
Well, the original Peterson House book, the one you're holding there,
Hmm.
which the cover illustration that you see there, I have it right here.
Oh wow,
That's the original
that's
artwork.
cool.
One of the first things.
What does
It's
that
an
date
original
to?
watercolor
Wow.
of the that done by a itinerant Englishman who was here in the United States. And doesn't it make a beautiful cover?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's perfect.
And what's nice about the this is you can almost imagine him sitting his paintbrush this far away, and in this portrait there's dust from the road and there's pollen from the air from the 1860s 1870s when this was done. And I love the caption on the bottom, the last house of President Lincoln.
Yeah.
This is an Englishman, so he
Yeah.
has no earthly idea that Lincoln did not live there. He died.
That's
But
funny.
that book came about because I had started my Oldroyd um, journey, and I had been to his grave several times. And there's a funny story I can tell you about that. Um, been chasing him. We called it chasing Oldroyd. All my
Nice.
friends knew, my family knew. They got to the point where they didn't want to hear it anymore. And I went out there. I took some friends out there to the house where Lincoln died and to see Washington, D.C. And as we're walking around, I'll show you, I was wearing this shirt. It says, um, it's an
That's,
old droid thing you
you
wouldn't
wouldn't
understand.
understand.
My wife bought it for me. So
Nice.
that's how she knew I was that much of a fan. I was wearing it in the house where Lincoln died. And we're waiting for the tour to start. And some guy comes running down from the ranger comes running down, catches me in the bookstore, and I thought, oh, this can't be good. And he said, "Where'd you get that shirt?" And he said, "I know I'm not supposed to ask, but why are you wearing that shirt?" And so I told him who I was and what I was doing. And he promptly said, "Well, come with me," and took me upstairs to the
Oh, wow.
offices there. Left my friends and family downstairs by themselves, but took me upstairs and talked to me. His name was Roger Powell,
Oh,
Ranger
Roger's a
Michael
great
Powell.
ranger. Yeah, I've met
Very
him.
one of the best, one of the very great
Yeah.
stories, great man. And he took me up and he said, "Well, here, you might as well take this. I've had this inventory." It was just a copy of an inventory, of Coe's inventory. And I said, "Well, thank you." And I took it home with me. I already had it, but it was nice that he gave it to me. And he said, "When you want to come back and research, come back and research, and I'll get you into all the places which is, as you know,
Yeah, it's
not that easy."
challenging. Yeah.
So he took me into not that day, but on a subsequent visit, took me into the house where Lincoln died, all over the place, upstairs, downstairs, English basement, all of it. And he explained to me that there hadn't been a proper updated history of the house since, I believe, 1936, maybe. There'd been plenty of pamphlets, but nothing since then. There are great swaths of information that had been lost, including the complete restoration during LBJ's administration and a slight restoration of the 50s. So he encouraged me, and in fact, he's pictured in the book. And when I came back for the 2015 thing, the 150th anniversary, I talked to him again. He took me all over the place and said, "Anything that we've got, we'll." Um, Took me on a backstage tour of Ford's Theater as well.
Nice.
I didn't get to go in the booth. I don't. Have you been
Yeah.
in the
I never
one of
have.
those?
I've gotten as
Yeah.
close to, the glass door so you can see into it, but I've definitely tried, but no, I've never been allowed in the
Yeah.
box.
No, and he didn't allow me, and that's
Yeah.
fine. I wasn't going
Yeah.
to push. But that's how it started, and it came together at a time when I had a lot of these things in my own collection because I'd already been working on Oldroyd. I'd
Yeah.
purchased several collections of items, so that gave me the opportunity to use them. And I've always been a picture guy, as I said, from a
Yeah.
young age. And I know that people like to see pictures, and I'd like to try and tell them what they're looking at when they're looking at a picture and what is important about that picture. So I put that together. The bad thing was I went through a publisher, and lo and behold, right when I get it done, the COVID pandemic hits,
Ah.
and everything screeches to a halt. And it pretty much killed the book. Eventually, killed that publishing house.
Oh, that's
Uh,
too bad.
yeah, and that's the thing. That's the big difference. Um, you got to remember, I'm a newspaper guy,
Hmm.
and I've sat in my career and just watched newspapers all over my home state and city. They just evaporate. They're here today and they're gone the next day. Newspapers are dying.
Hmm.
Bookstores are dying. Um, are dying. It's things have changed. Everybody's a blogger. There's so much information on the net. So after the book that you're talking about was published, I decided, in talking with a few friends in Springfield, James Cornelius and Doc Temple, Richard Sloan, Jason Silverman, all very good men, better Lincoln guys than I am. Tim Good and Susan Hake. They encouraged me to go forward with this, which I'd already was going forward, but I was at a stalemate because I didn't know what to do. It's hard to find a publishing house now.
Yeah.
And talking to Doc, who's the greatest living Lincoln historian in the country today, he explained to me that I had these problems in the 50s and the
Hmm.
60s. It's hard to find a publishing house. Talking to James Cornelius, he tells me that it's unless you are publishing a scholarly work through a university press, it's hard to find a publisher because they're looking for romance novels or thrillers or horror things. History's a hard sell now.
Yeah.
So that's why I went the second route with the self-publishing thing, because Doc Temple, I think you had asked me earlier, What did I learn from Doc Temple?
Yeah, well, hang
And
on. Let's get into Doc. Actually, I do. I want to make sure we give him some
sure,
time. And I 100% agree that self-publishing is the way you want to go, especially if you want to tell the story your way. Because even if there was a publisher who wanted to publish your Oldroyd book, they would never let you publish as much as you have in here. They
no,
would cut
no,
it to
they would
pieces,
cut it severely.
and then while it,
And 10 pictures, 10, 12 pictures is
yes.
all they'd let me do.
Exactly. So I'm glad that you have gone self-publishing because it allows you to tell the full story. That's why this is the book on Oldroyd, and there will never be a better one because you're able to get everything in it that a publisher would make you cut.
Well, to
So
paraphrase Doc Temple, he said, if
yeah.
anybody ever attempts to write another book on Oldroyd, they're a damn fool.
Yeah, exactly.
If you
So
know Doc, you know that's how he talks.
let's talk about Dr. Temple. Can you introduce him, to our audience the same way, I mean, as you introduced Oldroyd? So who is Dr. Wayne Temple?
Doc Temple, and of course, to me, the Oldroyd connection is there. He's born in 1924. He's born about 45 miles from where Oldroyd was born, which is
Mm,
cool.
yeah.
He's an Ohio kid. He went off to war. He will be the last living um, veteran of that war that I will be able to talk to that actually stood in a road in Germany with a Thompson submachine gun and fired at a German bomber bearing down on him. It's like something right out of the
Wow.
movies.
Yeah.
Doc did that. That was his first introduction to manhood. He's a young man then, and he had decided somewhere in Europe, in Germany, that he wanted to be involved in history, not
Mm,
necessarily Lincoln, but history. He knew he wanted, he's an Ohio kid, so he's thinking Ohio State. Well, during the war, he came through Illinois. And while in Illinois, he went to the University of Illinois in Champaign. And he had the good fortune to take a history class under James Garfield Randall, J.G. Randall,
mm.
one of the best, greatest Lincoln men in the history. And Doc said he knew everybody, and he
Yeah.
did. And Randall, he ended up being Randall's last PhD student.
Ah,
When Randall died, Doc was almost done with his PhD. And from that point on, he had decided he was going to be a Lincoln man. He started out. He wrote a book on the Indians of Illinois, which is still to this day the standard in the field on the Indians. But that was, he's told me, the interest was there, but it was basically because they offered me more money than I could carry as a kid, you know.
yeah.
And so I did it, thinking this is how I'm going to survive and get through school. From that point on, he started going towards the Lincoln route. He went to the Illinois Historic Museum, worked there for a couple of years, and then he was contacted by the Lincoln Memorial University in Harrogate, Tennessee, and they said, we need a Lincoln man down here, and we'd like you to come down here. So he went down to LMU, and there he took over the reins of the Lincoln Herald, which was the only publication devoted only to Lincoln to be published at that time. He ran that for 15 years
Mm.
as the editor. He developed Lloyd Ostendorf, the famous Lincoln artist. He was the one that gave him the greatest exposure, and a bunch of authors, Bud Robertson and Bruce Catton, a lot of guys that were just starting out. Doc gave them their first introduction. He decided he wanted to go back to Illinois. He wanted to go
Mm.
back to Springfield. His new wife was from Springfield. So he went back to
That
Springfield
same
and
connection, just like
it,
Oldroyd and his wife having the in-laws
exactly,
in Springfield.
exactly. Lois was from Springfield. So they went back to Springfield, and he went to the Illinois State Archives.
Mm.
And there I don't want to get him wrong. It's such a long time. He was there from 64 to 2016 as the chief deputy director, not the
Wow.
entire time, but most
Sure.
of that time,
Hmm.
serving 9 secretaries of state and 10 governors of both parties.
That is
And
not
Doc
easy to do in the state of Illinois.
You're
You
absolutely
you get
right.
kicked out very easily in the state of
And that
Illinois.
tells you all you need to know about Doc. Doc is the
Yeah.
most gracious man you'd ever want to meet. He swears that I'm a scholar, and it annoys him when I tell him I'm not. And I love him for it.
How
We
did you first
started
meet
this.
him?
Well, James Cornelius, when after he left the ALPLM, he went and worked at a bookstore right off the town square because James is he's all about books. He's a bibliophile like you would not believe. He was born to books. So that was his perfect, that was his haven. And I happened to go in there. Richard Sloan actually told me that James was there. So I called James. We had met before. And I came out to see him and we developed a relationship. And he said, "Well, what are you working on?" And I said, "Well, I'm working on an Oldroyd book." And so we sat down like you and I are doing in the back
Hmm.
room of that bookstore. And we talked. And he said, "I didn't know any of this about Oldroyd." And that's what you want to hear from the curator of the ALPLM. Well, I'm glad. I'm glad you didn't know this. I taught you some. So he said, "Well, and I told him about Doc, and I told him that Doc was my mentor. And he said, "Well, this is a Thursday night." He said, "Doc and I have been getting together. It's 2021, I believe." He said, "Since 2019, Doc and I have been getting together on every Thursday to just sit and talk." And he said, "Would you like to come along?" I nearly jumped out of the chair and I just tried to keep it together. I said, "Oh, yeah, that might be interesting." And James said, "Well, we get together and we drink a little Miller beer and beer nuts, and we swap Lincoln stories. Can't get any better than that."
Yeah.
So I called my wife and said, "Honey, you're going to have to find something to eat in the hotel room. I'm going to be busy." So we went over there, and I've interviewed senators, presidents, astronauts, rock stars over my years. I've never been as nervous as I was going and interviewing Doc Temple because he's that potentially uh, intimidating. He's not at all. Nicest man you'd ever want to meet in your life. Knows everything about Lincoln at the age. Then it was 99 years old.
Mm.
At the age of 99, he's ticking off dates on the River Queen. He's
Wow.
ticking off dates in Congress when Lincoln went up to Niagara Falls. He's just all over he's got it going on. And I can't even remember my kids' birthdays. And he's got stuff. Oh, that was in, August 9th of 1841. I'm like, wow, wow. How do you remember this? So I walked away from there and I went straight home back to the room to Rhonda. And I said, "There's a book here."
Ah,
And Doc Doc had said, "Well, I always thought somebody would write a book about me, but I never did happen." So I said, "I have an idea." So I asked James and kicked it around James, and James said, "Yeah, Doc would like that," and he did, and that's how it started. I talked to Doc every Thursday night for over 2 years,
mm,
um, in person as much as I can, over the phone religiously.
mhm.
And I've spent hours and hours and days with this man, picking his brain and to gathering all this stuff. And I put it together and I took it out to him. And the best compliment you can get as a writer is to give a person their life story and for them to tell you, "I don't even recognize this guy because this is like I'm reading someone else's life. I didn't realize." So I covered everything. Now the funny thing is
Everything so
uh,
far, of course.
yeah, everything so far.
Yeah.
The funny thing it doesn't come without uncomfortable moments because Doc's been married 4 times, and
Okay.
he literally has forgotten 2 of those marriages. And I brought them up and I said, "Tell me about your first wife." And he starts talking about another lady. And I said, "No, no, not that lady, this lady." And James was there as my witness, or nobody would believe me. And then he didn't remember his third wife. So, and he says, "Oh no, I'd forgotten all about that." And I said, "Well, Doc, we got to cover it." And so he told me, and it's all pretty interesting. And when you're dealing with somebody that's lived that long in the Lincoln field, he knew everybody. I mean, where else are you going to talk to somebody today that could walk into Carl Sandburg's house,
Yeah.
which is now a museum?
Yeah.
Sandberg's been gone so long. And the stories that he tells about Illinois government are hilarious.
I'm
Kerner
sure.
was a Kerner was a great guy, but he liked to bend an elbow every once in a while. His breath might smell like booze, but he was a good guy. He was a good guy. My favorite story, I don't know if you've read it or not, but he talks about Doc is the last living member of the uh, Civil War Centennial
For the 100th. Yes.
Commission and the Lincoln Civil War Centennial Commission, last living member. And he talks about it. It became something. The timing was terrible for it because it's in the middle of the civil rights. Nobody wanted to revisit the Civil War, so for the first year or so, it kind of muddled through, but then it kind of fell apart, and it really destroyed U.S. Grant III because that was his baby.
Mm.
Uh, but it is largely forgotten. But Doc told me a story about Shelby Foote, and everybody remembers Shelby Foote from Ken Burns. If you
Hmm.
haven't read his books, you know him from Ken Burns' documentary. And he said the last event took place here in Springfield at a hotel in Springfield. It was to wind everything up in 1965. And everybody was there. He said Carl Sandburg was there, Robert Todd Lincoln Beckwith was there. Every Lincoln scholar was in the room. And Shelby was the best Civil War speaker, renowned for his great speeches. And they paid him a bunch of money to come in and speak on this, the last thing. And Doc says, well, Shelby liked to drink a little bit. And he said, Shelby got up to the rostrum and the whole room was quiet. And Shelby taps the microphone and we're waiting for this great speech. And Shelby says, well, it's such a beautiful day today. I think we'll just all go outside and take a walk. And Doc said, that's how the Civil War sesquicentennial ended. Who else could tell you that but Doc
Yep.
Temple? So that's why he's a lovable man.
What after spending so many Thursdays with Doc, which of course is the name of the book, Thursdays with
Mhm.
Doc, Recollections on Springfield and Lincoln. After so many Thursdays and phone calls and everything, what lessons do you think you've learned from him? Yeah, and like what is he's very inspirational as a subject, and I understand why you were motivated to write a book. But from as opposed to Oldroyd, where it's you're writing a biography of someone who is long past, and so you're instead dealing with a living subject. You have a better connection to them. What are the big lessons you've gained, or things you appreciate the most about Dr. Temple?
Well, he is the fact that he's a lovely man bears out in everything he does. He would in lucid moments he would tell me who was a nice guy and who was not a nice guy. I didn't put any of that in the book, but it gives you a better feeling of the people that you've read their works, you've heard their names, and it gives you an insight into who this person is, something that you would not have known personally because they're long gone.
Yeah.
But Doc's was insatiable researcher. Uh, Recommends to anybody that they go from primary sources. Don't go
Yeah.
from other people's books. Certainly don't go from anything on the net, which he's never used and never will. Go from primary sources, and most importantly, get the information out there. Do what you have to do to get the information out there, because generally, like you, like me, we write about things that we think have been underserved and
Yes.
maybe have not been as much. And he said, this is what needs to be out there. You need to get the truth out there. You get that from primary sources. You clear up any of the fog that may be surrounding it to try to quash these rumors that just aren't true. And he just kept saying, whatever you do, make sure you get the information out there. I told you earlier that we were battling COVID during this process. I was
Yeah.
shut down for 2 years. All the research facilities were shut down. So I couldn't do that. And then this past year, I've spent. My wife is battling cancer,
Yeah.
which is a came as a blow to both of us. She's tough, and she's a lot tougher than I am. But it touched Doc because Doc, when I first met him, had just lost his longtime wife, and
Mm.
he fell in love with Rhonda, my wife, and so he always said, take care of her. Don't worry about my book. Don't worry about Oldroyd's book. Take care of her, get her right. But when you do, get Oldroyd out there because people need to know about this.
Yeah.
And coming from the guy who was the chief authority on Oldroyd to that time, for him to say that means a lot.
Yeah.
So I learned that whatever you do, get the information out there. And the best example is Doc. He started a book on Noah Brooks when it was his thesis, his master's thesis on Noah Brooks, and he was given the task by James Garfield Randall himself.
Mm. Yeah.
And then Randall suggested build on this, take it as far out as you can until you get everything you do, and then publish it. Well, it took Doc over 4 decades to get the Noah Brooks book published.
Wow.
He finally got it published. And why? Because he wanted to get the information out there. So don't give up. whatever you're working on, if you're proud of what you're doing, if you feel the research is solid, get it out there any way you can.
Yeah, and that is my, you as a former educator and me as well, that's why we do this is
Yeah.
it's not for ourselves, it's because this is information that we feel people that is, like you said, underserved and, deserves to be learned about. And these are people whose stories deserve to be known because of the influence they had on, as you said, not just in the greater sense, like, both Oldroyd and Doc as great Lincoln like collectors and scholars, but even in the more personal, like that story about Doc, making sure that influencing you to make sure your wife comes first in this time,
Yeah.
yeah, get the information out there if you can, but that is why their stories deserve to be told because of the basic
And
humanity they're
that's
showing.
why he lasted 10 governors and 9 secretaries of state.
Exactly. Yeah. So both of these books are available on Amazon already.
Amazon. Amazon
So
already.
that's where you can purchase them. So there's Thursdays with Doc, and I realized I was showing off the Oldroyd book, but never actually gave the full title. And so it is Osborn H. Oldroyd, Keeper of the Lincoln Flame, which is a great
That's it.
title. Really like
That's
that.
it.
And of course, the foreword is by Doc Temple. So you
Yeah.
put him to work a little bit.
Yeah.
Uh,
He
and
sat down, James informed me that he sat down and wrote that uh, freehand, and it took him an hour, and he didn't stop. So that shows you how sharp he is. If you read that forward, it's a complicated forward.
Yeah, absolutely. But I understand too, so they're already available for purchase, which I hope everyone does, but I
Right.
understand that right now we're filming this in January of 2025, but I understand next month that you are going to have an official book release in Springfield for these two books. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, I've been fortunate. The Lincoln Symposium 216th birthday this year is going on the same weekend. I'll be there. It's Sunday, February 16th at 10 a.m. at Books on the Square. That's at 427 East Washington Street in Springfield. It's right across from the old state capitol building. And this is where James and I first came up with the idea of the Doc book, and where we spent many, many hours talking about Oldroyd and things related to Oldroyd. What makes it cool is this bookstore is located in Billy Herndon's old office that he used when he was
Ah,
mayor of Springfield. And that intrigued me. So I, of course, made James take me all over the place, and we found the stairs are in the front that Billy Herndon would have run up to. Well, Lincoln was there. Lincoln had to have been there on
absolutely.
several occasions. So it's a historic building. It is a great bookstore. I'm going to go talk to people that probably have forgotten more about Lincoln than I'll ever know. That's what happens, as you well know. You've spoken to
Absolutely.
Springfield before. You're talking to a bunch of authors and Lincoln scholars. So it can be intimidating, but it can be an awful lot of fun too. So,
That's awesome. Well, Al, I'm so grateful that you're able to talk with me today. In addition to purchasing your books, which again, I mean, I have the three Lincoln adjacent ones, and you have many other ones. Other than purchasing your books, where else can people find you and read your stuff? I know you have a great website, so that's why I want to make sure you plug that a little bit.
yeah, you can plug in Alan E. Hunter, and I come up. My blog spot comes up, and it's the columns from that I've assembled over the years, and with more profusely illustrated than I can in a newspaper column. Which
Absolutely.
pictures are my thing, and I love to try to find pictures that maybe you don't see every day. And the goal being that if you read something about this person or this aspect of Lincoln's life, there's an image in there that you did not know existed, that I've hunted up and put in there. And like you, a lot of peripheral people, that have come in and gone. Lewis Gardner Reynolds is a particular favorite of mine. Took over for Oldroyd at the house where Lincoln died. These are the people that I've tried to flesh out who they were, because nothing has been written about them.
Right.
And if you can do that, if you can inform people, especially Lincoln people, of something that they did not know, I think you've accomplished the task. And you do that all the time with your blog, so your
We
website.
try. That's the goal. Show off a little
And
bit.
I must tell you that when I came back from that meeting in Springfield, I told my daughter, who was in college at the time, I said, well, this. She said, well, who was this guy? So at the time, you had it called Boothie
Yeah,
Barn.
I was Boothie Barn. Yeah, you asked me.
Yeah,
I think that's
and
if you asked me if I was Boothie Barn, and I was like,
yeah,
yes, I am.
yeah, yeah. And I told her that because I knew the name would resonate with the college kid more than Lincoln conspirators. You know how
Yeah.
college kids are. And she said, and I said, well, it's the only blog I subscribe to. And her words to me were, that's cute. My daddy subscribes to a blog. I'm so
Well,
proud of you, Daddy.
I am subscribed to your blog, and I do even your not your, like I said, your columns, your history columns are always fascinating, and I love, it. You do stuff on Lincoln, but also a lot of not on Lincoln. And it seems like
Yeah,
right now you may be trying to make up for the lost time when you were working
I,
on your book, because now
I
I'm getting
am.
emails from you every couple days for
I'm
a week.
sorry about that.
No, it's great. I already saw, I was reading your Ambrose Bierce one that you just published today because
Yeah.
I, in high school, loved Ambrose Bierce, and
Yeah.
also, and he's one of those who just disappears. He's such a great author, and the
And a
connection.
Hoosier.
And a Hoosier, that's right. And so it's like, okay, it's so you have a great, blog, and especially those of us who don't live in the area, we can see your columns in print. I love that you put all that out there,
Well,
digitally
thank
so
you.
that we can do it. One last question, because you had told me that there was a story, and I think it ends well for here about. I was going to wonder. I know you had visited Oldroyd's grave multiple times. His picture is in there. I've also been there at Rock Creek Cemetery in D.C. What was I guess maybe the first time you visited, or just the times you went? What was it like to come, I guess, face to face, as close as you can to your subject after you've been doing research for so long?
Yeah. Well, the first time I went was in 2013. And the hardest part was finding it then.
Yes.
But then I went back in 2015 for the 150th anniversary, which I retraced Booth's escape route, which was kind of fun. And I went back to Rock Creek, and then I went back a few times after that. About on my fourth or fifth visit, I went in to talk to the people in the building and the administration, and I asked them if they knew the history of the people in those plots, and they said no. They asked me who I was, and they asked me what I was doing, and so I told them the history of because there's several people buried in that plot, and I left because the administrator said, "Well, we have no one to contact for his grave," and I said, "Well, you won't because they're all gone. All his people are gone." He had one daughter, he had one granddaughter. Again, in the book, I write about Josephine, sad story, born in the house where Lincoln died, died in the house where Lincoln
Mm,
died as a child. So again, people forget that the house where Lincoln died, people lived there. They
yeah.
lived their lives there. So this woman said, well, would you mind if we put you down as the contact person on the Oldroyd grave? And I said, why? And they said, well, if just in case it needs to be moved or something happens or we need somebody, um, we've never had anybody ask about this grave before. So I gave him my reporter's card and it's in the file. And I walked out of that building thinking that's very strange that I came here and I started this and I'm walking away as the caretaker of Oldroyd's grave. Tim Good at the Lincoln House laughed and thought that was the greatest thing he'd ever heard.
I mean, I think it's very fitting, as you called your book, that Oldroyd is the keeper of the Lincoln Flame. You
Yeah.
are now the keeper of the Oldroyd Flame, as you deserve to be. So I love that story that you are now the the emergency contact for
Yeah.
Oldroyd.
Yeah. It's kind of like being the best ballerina in Omaha, but I'll take it.
Hey, you never know. Well, Al, I can't thank you enough for coming in and talking to me today. I know we went way longer than we
I
thought,
know.
but I appreciate it. And
That's what the editing process is for,
oh,
right?
I'm not editing everything out of this. This is like your book, Al. I'm not cutting anything out. Trust me.
Throw it out there while you can.
That's right. As I said, like Doc tells you, you get it out there exactly. So I'm
Yep.
gonna do that. But yes, please, those of you who watch this, please check out Al's books. Like I said, they're available on Amazon. Osmond Oldroyd, The Keeper of the Flame. Thursdays with Doc are the new ones. He also has this wonderful Peterson House book. You want to learn about the National Road, about haunted Irvington,
Indianapolis, heck yeah.
Indianapolis, and all those different things. Please, you're a prolific writer, even though you claim just to be a newspaper man. But I can't thank you enough for coming on and talking with
Well,
me
it's been
today.
fun. It's been
Uh,
fun.
all right, thank you everyone for watching from LincolnConspirators.com and AlanEHunter.com. Is that what it is?
Something like that.
Something like that. You
I'm an
Google his
old guy.
name,
Just type
something
my
like
name
that.
in on the computer. I'll come up.
Yeah, exactly. He'll pop up. But thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.
Yeah.
Bye.